So the month of April was quite slow, and I would like to think that's because the federal election put people in this position where they might as well just wait to see how things happened before they go ahead and make a move. Now we are seeing some price reductions and some price decreases, but it will be interesting to see if those price decreases stay persistent throughout 2025, or now that the election is over, if we're going to see some increases just based off of new stimulus packages and people migrating to Calgary. At the end of this video, I'll highlight a couple of things that I have brought up and think that could happen because a Liberal government is now in, but I'm going to record a video kind of mid to late month about that specific topic of how the Calgary real estate market is going to be affected from the Liberal government. So if we look at this here, you can see that the price point has ever so slightly reduced from the month prior, which is more or less a flat line than a reduction if you actually put that in consideration. Sales have actually upticked, and so has inventory. So we are still trending in a decent enough direction with the sales, considering a lot of people were kind of waiting on the sidelines. So it will be interesting to see how that actually gets reflected into May numbers for next month. Now, my name's Adam Fyfe, your Calgary Realtor. If you're looking at getting into the market, go ahead and book a call. It is the second link in the description of every single video. We can go through, we can create a game plan for you personally, look at all the individual numbers, and try to actually create some sort of plan for you in the future. If you want to read the PDF reports, I upload those for free. If you want to actually go and figure out what's going on in Calgary, I have a link for that as well. So go ahead, click the link. You want to know what your home is valued at? Click that link. It's a really cool tool, but let's dive into everything else. Now, sales are down, new listings are up, inventory's up, and months of supply is up. So with this in mind, clearly the market is slowing down, especially compared to that super hot sellers market that we've seen over the past, let's call it 2 to 3 years. Now, we need to break it down into individual property types and communities and quadrants to really figure out what's going on for your personal situation. But overall, market definitely slowing down, which is was expected for 2025 in general. But now that we had an election, it really put a pause on that. So let's read what the Calgary Real Estate Board has written about this market. If you want to read it on your own, pause the video, skip to the next chapter, all good. Balanced conditions take pressure off prices. A boost in new listings this month relative to sales caused April inventories to rise to almost 5,900 units. While this is more than double the levels reported last year, supply last year was exceptionally low, and current levels are consistent with levels we traditionally see in April. Sales in April reached over 2,200 units, 22% below last year's levels, but in line with long-term trends. Economic uncertainty has weighed on home sales in our market, but levels are still outpacing activity reported during the challenging economic climate experienced prior to the pandemic. This in part is related to our market situation before the recent shocks. Previous gains in migration, relative stable employment levels, lower lending rates, and better supply choice compared to last year's ultra-low levels have likely prevented a more significant pullback in sales and have kept home prices relatively stable. The rise in inventory levels helped the market shift to balanced conditions with near 3 months of supply. However, conditions vary depending on price range and property type. Lower priced detached and semi-detached properties continue to struggle with insufficient supply, while row and apartment style homes are seeing more broad-based shifts to balanced conditions. So we just need to break it down. Now, if we look at the total residential price point, you can see that we are down 4.1% from last year, okay? So we are seeing the total residential price point fall. It's at $591,100. So when we actually look at that, we need to put that into perspective of what that is. It was a 2000 built home, 3-bed, 2 full bath, 1 half bath, double detached garage, on a poured concrete basement, which is totally finished. So when you start to see this number for total residential, we do need to make sure we put those attributes in there, right? So when we go back to this chart, you can see that we have dropped fairly significant from last year, right? 605 all the way down to, let's call it 590, right? So we've seen a $15,000 decline. We did uptick a little bit from the spring market. Now with the election over, it'll be interesting to see if we continue to upwards increase in price point throughout the year. It is expected that Calgary is still supposed to gross 3 to 5% in 2025, which I actually do agree with, because I believe that we're going to see more migration come to Calgary, come to Alberta from this new election. So let's start to break this down into a little bit more detail. So this is the same information that we just previously looked at, but in a numerical number. So you can see that 592 down to 591. So we have seen a reduction of around $1,500, give or take, in this market, right? You can see that sales is at 22. So we did see a small increase. New listings stayed relatively, basically the exact same. Inventory though is actually increased. The days on market is at 29, which is the exact same as last month. You can see that last year we saw the same number, but a lot lower, 9 days lower. You can see that the benchmark price is 591. The median price is 590, which is increased from last month. And then the average price is also increased from last month to 646. So the average price, there's more sales in the upper end in April, but they actually drove that benchmark price down. This is why I don't like just looking at average, because this fluctuates so much, where you can see the benchmark price is a little bit more stable and it's tied to attributes, okay? So we can see that the chart here is we're actually now at under 0%. At the beginning of the year, I didn't expect it to happen this quickly, but when the federal election was called, it made sense that a lot more people were going to hold off and figure out what was going to happen with that election. So it's not overly surprising that we are already dabbling in that under or year-over-year loss, right? You can see the trajectory for the months of supply has sharply increased, right, over double. You can see that the months of supply were basically at levels that we saw in 2022, which was a pretty crazy year, but the benchmark price was a lot different from those years. So let's start to break this down, right? Year-to-date sales. So this is not just April, but the first 4 months of the year. We are still at that 10-year average. We have significantly dropped from what we've seen, but we are still above that 10-year average line. You can see that over the last, those super depressed years, we're averaging around 4 to 5,000 sales. Now we're averaging, let's just call it, 7,000 plus, right? Year to date. Now, when we start to break it down into price point, the red bar is 2025, the blue bar was 2022, right? So that year that we had the same amount of supply, the months of supply coming down really quickly, we had a lot of sales, right? Soaking up a lot of that inventory. And you can just see even just that sub 300,000 saw quite a bit of sales, right? A lot of homes were still very affordable in Calgary. Okay, have a pretty healthy line right across, right? You're averaging around 1,000 sales each, and then it dips down. You can see the million plus has actually saw an increase in the last 4 years. So that means there's more higher end product moving in our city than what we've seen over the last 4 years. So when we start to break it down into price range, it is interesting to see the $600,000 price range has saw the most amount of sales in general in Calgary, right? Followed by the 500,000. So these are going to be the most active price ranges, right? You have your luxury townhouses, your more or less luxury styled semi-detached in a way, and then you have a kind of entry level single family home. So if you're in the 5 to 600,000 in those price ranges, just be prepared that it might not be as much of a buyer's market as other areas like the $300,000 price range or even the million plus price range, stuff like this. But we can break that down in a second here. Now, interestingly, you can see that the total inventory or the amount of homes left over at the end of the month are at levels that we've seen over the last 11 years, right? So you can see 2021, 2020, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 2012, and 2011 have all seen the same amount of inventory that we're now at. But we need to put in consideration that the inventory levels are going to obviously increase in Calgary in general because new homes get constructed in Calgary every single year. So in 2018, right, we had about 9,300 starts. 2019, almost 11,000, 8,000, estimated about 14,000, 17,000, 20,000, 20,000. So yes, we have seen a big increase in inventory, which is welcoming news because we don't want to be in this ultra hot seller's market. But we also need to put in consideration that there's housing starts that happen every single year. A lot of these homes are new construction and obviously they're sold off market, so they're not going to reflect on the MLS. But we still need to put that in consideration that there is just inventory being added to our market every single year, right? So when we see these inventory numbers, we just need to put that into perspective as well, right? So we saw a 115% increase in annual housing starts from around 9,300 to 2,000, right? So in the last year, a lot of these are multi-family, right? Apartment buildings, townhouses, stuff like this. So obviously that number is going to increase, but that is a huge jump, over double jump from what we saw in 2018, right? So let's just keep that in mind. So when we look at total inventory for the month of April, you can see that the $300,000 price range, which is very common across the board, that is going to see the most amount of inventory. That is our apartment sector, right? You don't really dabble into too many townhouses. Yes, they are there, but it's mainly going to be apartment style condominiums in that sector, right? Followed by the $600,000 price range, which actually was the most active for sales, which is kind of interesting. And you can see just how many million plus city center single family homes there are compared to the other quadrants of Calgary. So this is just the inventory levels. Now, when we start to look at the new listings year to date, you can again see that trend line up over the last 3 years, right? We've dropped significantly from 2021 to 2022, but now we're on that way back up, right? You can see the detached is the most amount of inventory coming to the market, followed by the apartments, then semis, and then townhouses and then semis, right? So we are seeing a healthy increase in new listings, which is great news. Again, going back to more balanced conditions, getting away from that ultra sellers market. So the year over year is definitely going to be a little skewed because the last couple of years have been very aggressive. So again, trend line going up. You can see that the months of supply has been hovering around 2.5, 3 months. So the actual months of supply in general really haven't moved that much. We've stayed relatively consistent at 2.5 months, 3 months of supply. So it's not like we're really moving too much in that realm, but we are noticing some slowdown in that price growth. Okay. So when we start to look at months of supply, right, let's just try to break it down into individual areas, right? So if we start with the detached market, right, you can see that Northeast is the outlier, just like Northeast apartments is a massive outlier, right? It's over 7 months of inventory in Northeast. Lots and lots of inventory at this time. If you're a buyer, fantastic. You have lots of options. If you're a seller, really want to consider how much you're listing your property for, because you don't want to be left sitting on the market for very long periods of time, which is pretty likely in that quadrant. You can see that there are still some quadrants that are under 2 months of supply. You've got your south, your southeast, and your northwest. You can see that west, north, as well as east are just over 2 months. You've got your city center, and then your northeast, like we just mentioned. So when you start to move to apartments, you can see that everything is roughly around 3 months of supply, which is still somewhat of a healthy market, right? This outlier is definitely pulling up that average, right? Which is going to see the average definitely get pulled higher, but everything else is still at 3 months, which is still a balanced condition. Semi-detached, same thing, seller's market in a lot of areas, but definitely in more balanced conditions in some. And then townhouses, same thing, definitely seller's market in a lot of quadrants, but again, Northeast outlier. So you can make your comments as you will. Now, if you want to read what the Calgary Real Estate Board has written about each individual property types, go ahead, pause the video, read what they have to say, but I'm going to upload my individual property type videos over the next week and dive into those numbers as we go through each individual property. All I can say is if you want to have that conversation, go ahead, book the Zoom call. It's free, 30 minutes. We can just jam out about a little bit about your personal situation and try to find some sort of game plan that works for you. So here is the breakdown for the prices in Calgary. Now, it's very interesting to see total residential has fallen, but every other property type year over year is actually up. The total residential is not an average of the four. It's its own entity. So the total residential, like we talked about, was a 2000 and built home. So it actually has its own attributes. But when you start to dive into detached, semi-detached, row, and apartment, and you go to the attributes over here, and you start to dive into the city of Calgary, you'll find that every single property type has its own attributes. So yes, it's random. Yes, it's weird. Make your complaints to Calgary. Don't complain to me. Okay? You can ask your questions and I'll explain it, but I can't do anything about it. So single family homes have actually seen a flat line. It's a $500 reduction from last month. Semi-detached, flat line, a reduction of $200. Row townhouses have seen an increase of $3,400, right? And then apartment prices have flatlined. So even though the market has slowed down because of the election, and there's a lot of people who just kind of waited on the sidelines, we really didn't see any sort of price decreases per se in total of the individual property types. Yes, the total residential fell, but individual property types relatively stayed flat except the row townhouse. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this gets affected for the remainder of 2025, right? We're still up 18,000, 24,000, 2,300, and then apartments is actually very interesting because they're basically just flat. I would imagine the apartments are probably going to see the biggest decrease in 2025 compared to everything else, right? So it'll be interesting to see how that actually unfolds. So here's a quick snapshot of the market itself, right? So year to date, right? Last year we're at 5.5 bill. Now we're at 4.7 billion. Now for new listings, we're up quite a bit, 20%, right? Inventory, we're up quite a bit. Months of supply, we're up, which we already talked about. Sales to new listing ratio, right? Last year we're at 80%. Now we're only at averaging of 55% sales to new listing ratio. So definitely in that buyer's territory. Sales to list price, right? Last year we were up over 100%. A lot of things were selling over. Now we're at 98%. Days on market average for the year, right? You can remember that one slide we saw was 29 days. Now it's 32 average for the year. Benchmark average is 588, which is actually up from last year. So we did have a couple of months that saw increases, even though the last month saw the decrease. The average is still up from last year in the benchmark price, still meaning that the average compared to last year is obviously on the up and up. Median prices increased. Average price in general for homes is up quite a bit, 6%. So yes, we have seen a slowdown, but are we in this dire situation where everything is falling? Absolutely not. We've just slowed down, and we've seen a stalling of the price growth in Calgary. Right? This is very interesting because when you start to look at this, right, you see negatives all over the city, right? This is the benchmark price for the individual community. So you have to go to the attributes, you have to look for that quadrant's attributes, and you can see year over year, everything is down, right? Just like that total residential number, the total residentials in Calgary are down for the quadrant. So all property types morphed into one number for that property type in that quadrant. The only one that saw any sort of increase was south. Everything else is still down. So if you want to know what your home is valued at, you find it very interesting that the market is slowing down, go ahead, scan this QR code, put it in. It's an instant home evaluation tool. It's me and my team that looks at it. Yeah, of course, we're going to reach out. Hey, how's it going? You know, what can we help you with? Are you looking for a refinancial or a renewal of some sort? If you're just kicking tires, you're thinking about making a move in 6, 12, 24 months, that's cool. Let us help you out where we can, okay? So let's dive into the numbers here, okay? I'm going to zoom in so we can't skip ahead too much. Now, when we start to look at the individual quadrants and individual property types, it paints a very different picture, right? This is going to actually break it down to better reflect your personal situation. So we got our sales, our new listings, our sales and listing ratio, the inventory, the months of supply, the benchmark price, the year over year percentage growth, and then the month over month. So I need to kind of get rid of this camera here, but it's too bad. I can't do that. So if I actually increase this a little bit and I zoom in, we can start to see quite a bit of reds. This is actually kind of awkward now. You can see quite a bit of reds here, right? So if we actually look at the single family homes, right? You can see single family homes in Northeast and North both saw decreases. $9,200 decrease for single family homes in North, $4,700 in West, $4,600 in Southeast. But on the same breath, we're still seeing increases in City Center as well as South. Right? You go to the apartment market, right? Everything is basically declined minus South as well as Northwest, right? They've seen more or less a flat line. Northeast, month over month, saw a $4,800 decrease, right? And so did Southeast as well. Two of the quadrants that have the most amount of new construction and the most amount of inventory in general, right? Like if we look at inventory here, pretty wild, like 218 units left over at the end of the month. City Center's massive. It's very, very large. It's full of condos. You can't really count that too much. But Southeast, right? They have 218, right? You look at semi-detached, right? You have an $11,800 decrease in North Calgary, right? A $5,000 in in West, as well as a $3,600 in Southeast. So looking at rows, you can see a lot of increases as well. Now, we just need to put this into perspective for your personal situation, right? We need to look at the market. You can't just look at these quadrant decreases and expect you to have those types of decreases in your personal area, right? What we'd want to do is let's go to Northeast as an example, right? Let's pull up apartments because that's fascinating. Over the last 30 days, sold in the Northeast apartments. If we go active pending, right? You can see 190 in the last 30 days, 24 sales. That's wild. So if we go here, let's look at those sales, right? Let's figure out how those sales have been affected. If we just go to the sales to list price ratio, just to see if anything sold over, and there was one in the last 30 days that sold over 3%. Listed at 320, they end up getting 330. Good for them. Congratulations. Everything else is around that, mid to low 92 to 97%, right? Lots of sales and lots of days on market, right? So if you're going to list your apartments in Northeast, let's make sure that we're putting this into consideration, right? We can also pick on Southeast, 73 sales, a lot more activity in this. And you can see the highest amount was only 1%. 100%. They didn't even get 101, right? If you go all the way down here, you can see it drops all the way down to 91. 385, got for 350. So where I'm getting at is let's try to break this down as much as we can for your personal situation and have a clearer view as how this is going to affect you. And how that's done is through a Zoom call. So book the call. Now, total residential, again, already touched on this. We're in those negative year-over-year price growth. I don't personally think we're going to stay in this very long, right? That's my personal view of that. It's hard to say just because of it's a total residential number. It's not actually the individual property types. What makes it a little bit harder to try and pinpoint if it's going to grow or not, because it is kind of an average, but it's not, because it's own thing. It's weird. So we can see that as if we get upwards of $600,000 in September, which is likely to see, then we're going to get out of that year-over-year growth. But if we start to break it down into the individual property types, you can still see where year-over-year positives for all of them. It's the total residential that kind of makes it mad or tricky to time. So I would imagine we're probably going to stay in the negatives for probably 6 months, 6-ish months for the total residential. That's my goal. That's my suggestion at this point. So we'll see if I'm right. Now, we have seen crazy increases in the total residential price point in Calgary, right? If you go 2020, right, you're at 425, right, in 2020. Now we're at just under 591. So yes, we've seen a pretty aggressive increase in Calgary over the last 4 or 5 years, right? It is obviously time. Markets go up, markets go down. You can see in 2022, we saw a pretty big decrease. Everyone thought that was the end of the world, right? 2024, we thought that it was going to, people were crying that we're going to see some major drops, and I can see that these things are going to continue to actually be brought into effect, but I just don't think the Liberal government is going to actually allow that to happen. I'm pretty confident that the Liberal government is going to continue to print money, and they're going to just inject cash into our economy. They're going to probably do some good things in terms of like the oil and gas industry, hopefully actually get some projects built, which is going to try and stir some confidence. Not as much as a conservative government would, but I think and hope that they're going to actually do things to actually grow this economy just based off of his personal economic background. I know there's a lot of negativity with this guy, Mark Carney. I know that there's a lot of weird things that go on, with the World Economic Forum and all this other stuff, but I would like to think, because he has an economic background, he's going to actually do things to grow our economy. There's not going to be nearly as much growth or as rapid growth as the conservative government probably would have stirred in our market, but I'm pretty sure we're still projected to see 3% increase in 2025. Now, this is an interesting one. This is just based off of some information that's available online. So when you look at the projections for Calgary, because of the federal government now being liberal, minority, what's going to happen? 3 to 5% annual growth through 25-26. Sales activity is still very high, 26,000, which is 20% higher than long-term averages. It's a more balanced market, right? More people are probably going to list, less people might buy. It really depends on migration and what happens with that, because I could see a lot of people migrating to Calgary because of this election. The liberal housing policies are having this accelerator fund, which I'll talk to about in new videos. They don't propose any new taxes yet. We'll see about that. Falling interest rates, right? We expect further cuts. Immigration still drives demand. There's still probably going to be a lot of interprovincial migration now coming to Alberta. I wouldn't be surprised if that's going to continue to trend through the next couple of years. Oil sector is stable but not surging, so it'll be interesting to see how the how the provincial government and the federal government get along, if at all, for the oil and gas sector. We're not so reliant on it as we used to be, but it's still very important that stays healthy for the Calgary market. And we're still very affordable, or not very affordable. We're still, quote unquote, more affordable than places like Toronto, Vancouver, right? Obviously, you want to look at the greater Toronto, greater Vancouver areas, but when you start to think about what a home cost in Alberta, especially in even just the outskirts of Calgary, like Okotoks and Chestermere and Cochrane, we're still very affordable, and people are still going to move here because of those affordability things. So that's probably going to push our prices up. So with that in mind, this is actually a very long update, so I appreciate those of you who stuck it along all the way through. If you have any questions, book the call. I hope this made sense to you. I'll see you in the next couple of days as I go through and record the single family update, because the single family home update paints a little bit of a different picture than what the total residential does. So thank you very much. See you on the next one. Peace.